So I'm going to turn it over to Julian. Now that we have a sense of the broad global landscape, the situation in 3 specific countries, and the impact on the individual level. Julian, you're going to have a heck of a time.
Well, we have a distinguished panel, but it's not a full panel. And first of all, I'm really pleased that we have at last moved on into the thing of this being about entry, stay, and residency. And I think that, but why haven't we got a full panel? It's a distinguished one. I'll introduce them in a minute, and I'll ask them to make a very brief remark before we move into questions from you. It's a scary subject for politicians, isn't it? This is a really scary subject. And we tried our best to get politicians onto this panel, from receiving countries, from sending countries, to actually talk through the issues. But they slightly dropped out along the way. Yes, no, because, and why is that? Well, because migration doesn't catch votes, does it? And migrants don't have votes in the main. So, you know, what do we do? What we heard from Peter was, most eloquently, is the fact that PLHIV are usually the people that scan the horizon about the things that are happening to them and the injustices that are done to them first. And they codify them. And Peter's work has been absolutely fabulous in doing that from a small NGO, mainly on a voluntary basis, but provides an incredible amount of data. And it's great that he's working with GMP to do that and make that better. And we also heard from Owie how he's turned his life around by helping others, regaining his self-respect, and it's showing that PLHIV have resilience when we're supported. So, you know, when it comes down to it, you know, let us in and let us work. I'm lucky, I'm a migrant worker in the EU. I have freedom, but I'm still a migrant worker. From Manuel, we saw the specifics and the almost Byzantine, outdated, and in some cases just plain stupid and wrong processes that are in place, both from a public health point of view and from a human rights point of view. But let's move on to our panel, because who we do have here is Asif, who's going to give us a very short trade union perspective. We have Joanne Limpasad, who is going to give us a private sector opening remark, please. I want them really short because I want to hear from everybody else. We have a very brave politician who actually got dragged into this, Senator Matt McCoy from Iowa, who came here to do criminalization and said, I'm up for this, I'm game for this as well, from the USA. So thank you, Matt. And we have Arthur, also from GMP, who's going to tell us about the shame of Singapore. So without further ado, Asif, over to you. And can we just, an opening remark, so we can just get some more framing around this. And there are 1 or 2 people I'm also going to pick on from the audience as well after that.
Thank you, Julian. We hear stories about deportation. Let me tell you a story of different kind. Jonathan is a truck driver. He's from Kenya. And every day he drives his truck along the northern corridor to Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi. He's HIV positive. Along the highway, when he's sick, he can stop in any of the countries' border point to have his STI treatment or even ARV without creating any problem in the national health system of any country, without offloading virus along the highway, but be more responsive, using condom whenever he needs, and also creating a free environment without fear and stigma. So I'm not saying that in countries, poor developing country, travel restriction is not there. Make no mistake, it's not only Middle East, it's in Europe, travel restriction and entry ban is in Europe, is in Africa, and is in Southeast Asia. So, and again, it's not only Muslim countries like Middle East, it's purely countries with predominantly Christian, predominantly other religion, also have travel restrictions. So it's everywhere. So it's not, we should not stereotype to certain part of the world. That's one message for us. And again, there's another point is that when somebody is deported, he's not or she's not losing job. He or she is losing her life or his life. Mm-hmm. Like we heard about an experience, a Filipino worker from Saudi Arabia. He was there for a long time. So he was not only working there, he had developed friends, he has developed a place which he called home out of home. So when somebody is deported, he's not or she's not just losing job, he or she is losing a life in some way. So we must take that point into account. It's not about one job. And from the trade union perspective, we must remember our receiving country is not doing any favor to anybody by taking workers. 95% workers in Middle East are migrant workers. Without migrant worker, they cannot build Burj Al Arab, that tallest building in the world. So we must consider that point, that none of the receiving country is doing any favor to anyone. Second point is that it's about right to work. Like I'm representing transport worker. I'm an able pilot. You'll be surprised that whatever my experience is, if I'm positive, I cannot work for any Middle Eastern airlines. Qatar Airways is so-called 5-star airlines. I cannot work for Qatar Airways, whatever experience I have. So it's really a barrier for me to share my experience and expertise, whatever I have. So we have to consider that in our discussion, that it's not only migrant worker with low skill, it's migrant worker with very high skill. So it's for everybody. Just one last point. From the trade union side, I think it's very important that we use important event to raise that highlight, because during the 2012 Washington, D.C. HIV conference, we put pressure on US government, and that really helped to remove the travel restriction. We have Russia holding 2018 World Cup. We have Dubai holding 2020 Expo. We have Qatar holding 2022 World Cup. I think it's time for us to use these events to put pressure and to create global attention, not only to 3 countries, but on the countries who are doing this. And I think trade union will be always with you who are here. I think you are interested, that's why you are here. We are with you. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to move swiftly on. If this mic is back on. We're going to move swiftly on to Joanne, who is going to give us a brief introduction to what some of the issues are for the private sector.
Sure. So I'm here representing Levi Strauss and the private sector. And from our perspective, like many companies who are at this conference, we've had a global HIV workplace policy that prohibits mandatory testing or disclosure of status, prohibits discrimination at work, and ensures that employees are granted similar rights in terms of conditions of hire, fire, promotions and relocations around the world. However, the issue of travel restrictions really impact us in terms of the fact that we are a global company with employees in 45 different countries makes it really challenging to really abide by these workplace rules that we have stated we would abide for. So I think it was said in this morning's open plenary, good intentions doesn't always lead to good implementation. So this has been one of the challenges we face as a global company, to move our best talent around and to put them in the best positions where they would have the most impact for the company. So for us, while travel restrictions is definitely first and foremost a human rights issue, it is also a business issue, and it is also prohibitive to conducting business globally in today's environment.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah. Before calling on what I thought was going to be our only politician, we actually have Senator Di Natale, Richard Di Natale here. We also have somebody from the Parliamentarians Forum of Asia Pacific, and we have somebody from India. I'm going to pick them out of the audience later. Pakistan, sorry. I'm going to pick them out of the audience later, but now I'm going to move on to Matt, who was a virgin to this issue a couple of days ago.
Well, thanks, Julian. For more than 22 years, the U.S. closed its doors to foreigners who were HIV positive, and as a result, we promoted a policy that provided false security, discrimination, and fueled misunderstanding of the disease. When this was lifted in 2009 by President Obama, with the urging of Congresswoman Barbara Lee and Senator John Kerry, and actually started under George Bush, the implications were that workers, students, and tourists, and those that were interested in adoption, could partake in the U.S. and as a result, HIV research and worldwide conferences could have access to the U.S. and travelers that had left in the past essential medications behind were no longer forced to do that. The U.S. is continuing to fight with an internal civil war over immigration, and more than 11 million workers every day in the workforce in the U.S. are doing jobs that are absolutely essential to the United States economy. And so this removal has had absolutely no implication of any data that we've seen that has caused any problems for the U.S., both from a medical, socioeconomic standpoint. It has been without merit, and as a result, I think the leaving this policy behind has been very good for the U.S.
Thank you, Richard. I mean, Senator Matt McAvoy, I think that one of the things is that, of course, other countries which have a more joined-up system of healthcare, right?
We're working on that.
Might actually disagree with you as to you know, whether it's you know, whether they can go down the route supposedly of taking those poor, tired, huddled masses and letting them all in, which you are starting to do in a little way. But I think that might be an interesting conversation to have with our Australian colleagues here, perhaps, as one of the tensions. But moving on, Arthur, because community comes first and last and everywhere here.
All right, thanks, Julian. Just to capitalize on the word that you use, shame, to Singaporeans, I feel ashamed being a Singaporean because Peter's slides, the 3 slides that you categorize all the countries with restrictions, Singapore appears in all 3 of them. And as countries start to remove these restrictions, we are still there. And it's just a small group of countries. It's really an embarrassment being a Singaporean, and we're a developed country like the US, but we're still having these gaps in government. So I'm just wondering how we can, work together, as what OE said. Can we strengthen intergovernment cooperation and partnerships? As what the lady said about having the business case, because in Singapore, companies do not want to lose their employees. They feel that, no, this worker is good and he can work, he's productive. Why is the government repatriating him based on his HIV status? He doesn't need to be sent back to his country. He can continue working in Singapore, but the companies are losing valuable staff. So how do we move on from here together?
Thank you, thank you. Well, that's our panel, except for one thing. I was just going to ask perhaps Richard or John whether they'd like to respond, Richard especially. And at the moment, Australia is red on Peter's map. Not a nice place. And I'm just wondering, what do you think might be the most important steps or that are possible for Australia to turn from red into a nicer colour on Peter's map? And you can feel free to come up and...
There you go. Thank you. Well, I'd like to see Australia go from red to green, actually, because that's the colour of my party. But Australia's got a lot to be proud of. We've done some wonderful things when it comes to tackling the HIV epidemic head-on, and the record of Australia, particularly among injecting drug users, which is an area I worked in before becoming a senator, is one that we should be proud of. We took a big step into territory that was very controversial, clean needles and syringes. We took on the epidemic amongst men who had sex with men in a very ambitious way, and as a result, we led the world on some of those things. So we should acknowledge that. But when it comes to this area, we've got this huge blind spot, a massive blind spot, And it's only possible because our Migration Act is exempt from our discrimination laws. So we have a specific carve-out that says through the Migration Act, you're exempt from laws which stop you from discriminating against people with disabilities. So we've got to just change that. That's a simple way of dealing with the issue, is to say that we can no longer make our Migration Act exempt from discrimination laws. In a practical way, what happens is that people have a health assessment done. If they're applying for permanent migration, and HIV is not mentioned specifically, but if any illness is said to impose a lifetime health cost, I think it's over $40,000, then that's a reason to prevent somebody from becoming a permanent resident in Australia. It's discrimination. That's what it is. It's nothing, pure and simple. I mean, there's no other way of describing it, and one thing that needs to happen is we need to change the law.
Thank you. Do sit, because I'm quite sure that other people would love to put you on the spot even more. But I'm just wondering whether there's anybody in the audience. John.
Thanks very much. Look, I'm John Hyde from the Asian Forum of Parliamentarians, former MP here in Oz. We've got a couple of our MPs here, Mr Dang Thong from Vietnam, Ms Mariam Aurangzeb, and they're here to learn as well. And what we're trying to do, we know that we've got to get a human rights-based approach to have impact on HIV, AIDS, and also on sexual and reproductive health and rights. And whereas we've got some of our countries, such as Thailand, are incredible with SRHR, free HIV drugs, non-mandatory testing, when it comes to migration, the barriers go up. So what we're trying to do, particularly in the Mekong countries and South Asia, is get our parliamentarians together and see that by having a human rights-based approach, all the wins that we're getting in public health and NCDs and in many regions getting HIV rates down, if we can get that into migration and treat migrants as equals, we're going to have the same results, not only for the health of human beings, but also to the Conservatives who only care about the economy, the economic benefits to your country. Thanks, Julian.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I notice that we've got two real people. No, I mean we've got two people from the floor. And the mic is yours, in whichever order you want to. You're both being very polite. Just get in there.
Is this on? Jeez. Chris Lamar, I'm a doctor working in Melbourne, and one of the interesting things about Australia is that we do have this discriminatory migration policy, and when it first originated, it was specifically said it was not a public health issue. So when it was introduced in 1989, HIV testing for migration was specifically said this is not a public health issue, it's about the burden on the public health budget. In the last, I think it's about 3 years or so, HIV has been specifically mentioned as a public health concern in that migration health requirement. And the phrase is HIV with a certain viral load, which is rather ambiguous, and no one's really been able to explain that, but it seems like a step backwards rather than a step forward. So just be interested in comments about that.
I think, I know that Peter looked into this when that change was made, and it might be interesting to hear a community perspective of whether that is a real change or whether why you are still keeping it red, Peter.
Well, I think it's not a real change. It's not a change at all. The only guarantee that we have is that you would not discriminate. But other countries, they would exclude and deport people living with HIV based on the fact that they cannot treat them. So the fact is that it's unjust, that there's no public health whatever argument that could apply, and it's a human rights violation. It's as simple as that. And as long as the country does have that, independent of what the explanation is, it is, in fact, discriminatory. And that's why it's a country listed as one of the red color countries for us.
Thank you.
Thanks very much to the panel. My question is also a clarification, actually. follows on from this discussion around Australia's situation. I'm at the Australian Federation of AIDS Organisations, we're the peak community body in Australia, and I think there's been some confusion. UNAIDS made a statement in the lead up to the conference around how Australia's really made some fantastic changes. I just want to agree with Peter that Australia should still be on the red list. One of the things that remains is that there is mandatory testing for HIV and no other illness in Australia for applicants for permanent migration, which, according to UNAIDS' own list of criteria for reforms that must be passed in order for countries to be removed from the naughty list, is what we call it, the naughty list, that HIV must not be singled out in a differential way. So I think there's a bit of misinformation that's around that makes it sound like things have been actually improved much more than they have. Also the increase in the threshold, which is what Chris referred to, of, oh, you'll only be excluded if the cost of treating you is more than $40,000 over your lifetime, is an increase, but it doesn't make any difference for lifetime costs for people living with HIV. So Australia has a way to go. I hope UNAIDS doesn't, despite the media release, actually remove Australia from the list of naughty countries, because HIV is still the only illness singled out for mandatory testing for permanent migration. And I just wanted to make, one comment and have any reflections in the room or from the panel. At our organisation, we also have concerns about it in terms of reaching and engaging with migrant communities who have higher prevalence of HIV, who believe that, oh, Australia screens, I got in, I know that Australia doesn't let HIV in. We've had forums in which people have said that to us, and so the notion that there is HIV here and that it's actually perhaps a problem amongst particular communities is a barrier. So there is a real misconception that our migration laws has on immigrants who do come in permanently, some of whom do have HIV because they may come through temporary programs first.
Thank you for that. And I would say that I think one of the really useful things about people living with HIV keeping the naughty list, because that's actually what we do in terms of the travel entry and residency restrictions, is that perhaps we are not as swayed by the politicians who effectively, for whom UNAIDS is actually the servant, not the master. So that once again shows how good it is to have an independent thing. You know, what most affects our lives is created and maintained by us as a data set. But Manuel, do you want to be put on the spot and yes. Respond?
In relation to Australia and New Zealand, there was set up a global working group, and normally it's our headquarters in Geneva that leads this work, but I'm on the discussions and I'm also on the copied on the information sharing. And there was this group decided to do an assessment of Australia practices and policies and also forms against the standards and the golden standards that the Global Task Force on Travel Restrictions set some years ago, and this task force was co-chaired by Geneva and the Norwegian government. And this task force concluding, and that working group, including Australian NGOs and IAS and UNAIDS in Geneva, came to the conclusion that Australia policies met the golden standards that were created by the task force. And this is why Michel Sidibe, my executive director, wrote to the Australian government saying that he was lifting Australia from the red color and putting in the green color with some recommendations behind. The devil is on the details, and his letter, he was sent to Australian government with a set of 12 recommendations to follow to continue in the green light. We are monitoring closely. This working group is still monitoring closely, and I think FAO has an important role in Australia to monitor the progress of the achievement of these recommendations from UNAIDS, so we might put Australia again in the red color.
Before we move on to the next question, I'd like to focus on another area or another part of the world which also has a highly socialised medical system that tries to look after all its citizens. Perhaps pick upon somebody in the audience, Ronald Bryant, to just ask Ronald, you know, the Dutch approach and across Europe in relation to documented and undocumented migrants and then being able to access medicine, I think is something that the sky has not fallen down by allowing it to happen. and it has quite an influx of inward migrants. And I'm really sorry to put you on the spot, but I thought it'd be useful to get something from another area. Are you all right with that?
Yeah, of
oh,
course.
thank you, my love, my flower, sweet.
Not always like to be on the spot, but okay. I have a sort of double feelings about the Dutch situation, because we don't have any HIV testing when migrants are coming to the Netherlands. We have within Europe a lot of workers from Poland and other countries are also moving to the Netherlands, and they are sort of free to work in our country. And when they are tested positive, well, they can be sent on treatment for HIV medication. But I'm more worried about also the Dutch people who want to work in other countries in the world, well, when they are working for Philips or for Hilton or other countries, or other organizations. So they are also limited in getting a job in the rest of the world. So that is what for me is also confusing. And I'm more worried also about the next few steps. You know, I know about the task force group, and I want to urge them, you know, to put that high on the agenda again from UNH or WHO. Because we're here in this conference, we're talking a lot about medication and about TB and other things, but we are talking, me also, I'm a positive person, we are just living as a person in a world where we have to work and we have to get moving to other countries or something like that, is for travel or for work. So it is desperate for us also to have no discrimination law on migration or on travel restrictions. So maybe the Netherlands is a positive example, but as a Dutchman, I feel myself quite limited in this area also. So.
Thank you, Ron. And of course, I think the interesting thing you bring up there is that working overseas for perhaps a really good employer who has signed up to everything at home, but effectively you get excluded or not able to do various things. And
what for me is interesting also, we have a lot of international students coming to the Netherlands. And what we see is that I'm also angry about that, is they get offered through our universities only a very limited healthcare insurance. And when they are HIV positive, in fact, that is already excluded from this healthcare insurance. So, and even our Dutch people are moving to another country. I got a family who was moving to Indonesia, and the child was HIV positive because it was adopted from Africa. And the child was excluded from that healthcare policy, what was in fact offered by a Dutch organization, an insurance company. And so I think in connection with healthcare issues, there's also in the Netherlands and also internationally, I think, a lot to do. And I'm wondering in a little bit, is someone from the ILO here also present? Who is from the...
Alice is from the ILO, and also ASAP, and I'm sure they will deal with that in their closing remarks.
Because International Labour Organization should be also have a very big vote in this area. Yeah.
Who is that?
Okay.
Fabulous.
Hi there, my name is Alex. I'm from the HIV/AIDS Legal Centre in Sydney, and sorry to take things back to Australia, but I'm one of the authors of the report that was being referred to before about entry restrictions for people living with HIV coming to Australia. I just wanted to clarify something about what our recommendations were and our findings, and in that report it wasn't found that Australia meets any sort of gold standard. We did find that Australia meets the recommendations and findings of the task team that was put in place looking at HIV-specific restrictions. We did find that the Australian legislation and policy discriminates equally against all people with all sorts of disabilities, including people living with HIV. And we're actually launching a complete copy of that report tomorrow at 12 p.m. in AFAO's G'day, Welcome to Australia zone, if you wanted to get a copy of it.
Thank you. Thank you. I really would like to. Okay, well... Oh, sorry, I missed you, my love.
It is not a problem. Thank you. I'm Ann Sultan with the Jackson Advocate newspaper in the USA. question, what is the view on travel or entry restrictions from those who are co-infected with tuberculosis and HIV?
One for the panel, I think. Peter.
I cannot say much about that. Sometimes people would come back to you, to me, and they would sort of raise questions like, so what is the impact if I have a hepatitis B? So there are certain countries that would not allow people with hepatitis B and co-infection into the country, but there's no mapping at all. So as far as I know, we've been the only NGO worldwide that sort of mapped the situation and can talk about that. What we would need to have is a better mapping system to put the data together, and then we could answer your question.
Just to clarify, were you talking about TB or Hep? Hep B.
TB, co-infection.
TB.
That I'm specifically looking at persons who are co-infected. They have both tuberculosis and they have HIV. So my question is, what is your view on entry restrictions that would not allow individuals who are co-infected with both of those two diseases?
Well, can I just say that let's look at the different routes of transmission between active TB and HIV, for a start. But if there are other people who'd like to address that.
Yeah, I actually can respond to that. So, for example, in Australia, you're not allowed to travel with active TB disease. That's not the same as TB exposure or evidence of past TB. So it's really only if you've got TB that's able to be transmitted to another person, and then you're not allowed to travel until that has been treated, but then you can travel after that. So I think it's universal that if you're able to, if you've got active TB that can be transmitted by airborne route, most countries will not allow someone to travel on an airline or come in with that. But I'm not sure about other countries where the restriction is for people that have had TB and have got evidence of having had TB in the past but are not actively ill with it.
And it just seems to me that it would be very, very sensible not, looking at the different routes of transmission, not to allow, that seems very sensible. Active TB not travelling would seem to be a very sensible idea, and I think we could all agree with that.
I think the key issue with this HIV-based travel restrictions was, and the key argument why it is discriminative, that there's no public health justification for these restrictions based on the transmission routes. And this is completely different with tuberculosis. And I don't say that there's no discrimination going on with tuberculosis, but it is based on the fact that in terms of public health speaking, it's different.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Lisa Bastian. I work for the Western Australian Department of Health in HIV policy. And just to, I think, extend some of the complexity of access to Medicare treatment for people who are diagnosed in Australia, who are here on 457 working visas, is that Medicare eligibility is a huge impost on people who are positive in Australia who are here on working visas. And there are some very powerful players in this mix. We have very powerful mining magnates who have direct access to the Prime Minister's office to pull overseas workers into Australia, into remote parts of Western Australia, skilled and unskilled workers, with the expectation that people will access private health insurance, which is not a consistent practice, nor is there a consistent access to HIV treatment provisions under private healthcare. So from a clinician's point of view, this is a hugely complex issue. The state system is picking up the diagnostic and pathology care and allied health care for people, but then is resorting to assisting people access generic drugs from overseas. So it's a hugely complex area, and I would please make a bid to the Australian politicians here, John from Western Australia, to consider this in any reform to legislation because the PBS eligibility is a real barrier to access to treatment. Thank you.
Yeah, I can maybe say a couple of things about that. Whichever you want. Yeah, just a couple of things. So for those people who aren't aware, what we're talking about is a special class of visa for people who are coming specifically for employment purposes. So we have people who are coming to Australia who apply for a permanent visa, who want to migrate permanently. That is a different class of visa to somebody who comes specifically for employment purposes, and those people who come under what's called a 457 visa, so they're working with a specific organisation, they don't get access to Commonwealth-funded medical treatment. And so it's a huge issue, and absolutely right in that there's an expectation that there should be private health insurance, but it's variable. Some people don't have the right level of cover and don't get access to treatment. The one thing I'll say also is in terms of permanent people who apply for a permanent visa, the one thing we don't discriminate against is if you've got money. So if you can demonstrate that you can pay for your treatment, then doesn't matter, you know, whether you're HIV positive or not, you're welcome. We're very, very egalitarian when it comes to people with a big bank balance. There's no discrimination whatsoever in those circumstances.
Thank you. I wish I was a millionaire. I could go everywhere. Couldn't we all?
I wish I would be a millionaire.
Peter, perhaps you could tell us about some of the... We've concentrated a lot on Australia. I think that's very appropriate, seeing as it's where we are. But can you tell us about a little bit more about Europe, perhaps?
There are not that many countries in Europe that would restrict entry based on the HIV status. So what we sort of gathered together, the information is really based on HIV status. So if a country would single out HIV, then we would collect this data. To my knowledge, there's only Cyprus left that would restrict entry, so they would screen migrant workers and would not let them in the country. In Central Europe, there are not, to my knowledge, there are not many other countries. There was one, I think, Moldova revised its restrictions, Tajikistan, but this is more or less not really Europe. If I can be honest.
What I was trying to drill down into is the effect of, you know, I know that my own country has been hot and cold on migrants, you know, over the last 20 years. First of all, it was people who slipped in underneath the net and eventually got access to medication by going to the European Court of Human Rights, and there being one judgment which allowed that to happen, but then that fell over in an awful lot of countries. So the EU has actually had a role to play in allowing migrancy from outside the EU. As EU enlargement has happened, that has rolled out in legislative and regulatory frameworks in very different ways. Denmark, until recently, I believe, well, yes, if you were an undocumented migrant, you were found out that you had HIV. They said, well, we've got so few people, and perhaps you'd be happier going home, but we will try and ensure that your medication is joined up in your country, in your village. And of course, we've had the Netherlands, which has refused people on the basis of their HIV status, and because they've turned around and said, we're giving money to the Global Fund. And so consequently, you've got treatment in your country, haven't you? So I think that, you know, it's not as rosy in Europe as we might think, and I still think an awful lot of work needs to be done there. But that was just a comment, and I think we've got two more, but perhaps you could. That's specifically what I was trying to drill down into.
But this, to me, this is a different topic. So one country would be Russia, for example, which is really bad on these screening policies and what we talked about. And in terms of treatment for undocumented migrants, this is not, for us, not the same topic. I mean, it is very difficult, and I worked on that a lot. And we had changes in law. So we have the UK example that would integrate undocumented migrants now into HIV treatment delivery. We had the opposite due to the financial limitations in Europe. We had Spain, for example, and Greece that would exclude the treatment for undocumented migrants, which is of course for them a big problem, because that means these people are going to die, and there's nothing we can do. There's only one state in Spain that was against that change in law, and this is not Catalonia, Andalusia. So they were defined and defended the rights of undocumented migrants, but for us this is a different topic. So we did not work on that. We just looked on entry and residence regulations, and if an HIV test is used to exclude the entry of those people. And again, since in Australia we still have mandatory HIV testing, Australia is on that list.
Thank you. Well, I'm hearing that a lot.
I will step back. If anybody else wants this mic, I will come off it. But so two things. One is I really feel that the undocumented migrants is part of the exact same problem as any other migrants, because the main trouble is that our money can move borders more easily than we can, and the stuff that we buy moves borders more easily than people can. And essentially, whether you're an international student that's going to pay some university in another country for your education, and they take your money, and as soon as you become a problem, they kick you out. If you're a worker, you're productive, and then when you're broken, you get thrown away. And this is the problem that exists across the whole migration and HIV issue. That's one thing. That's a moral failure, I think, of a lot of countries. And maybe the Middle East and Singapore are, an extreme. Australia still has no clean reputation there. The other thing is that it's a complete fantasy to have a public health policy that ignores the physical presence within the country of a whole bunch of people who with health needs, including HIV. And if the larger the population of undocumented migrants, then the larger is the disparity between the official figures and the official policies and the real physical needs of the people in the land that those people are supposed to be administering. And I think it's a wake-up call just to reality, as well as a moral failure that we're in at the moment.
Thank you. Yes. We've got 6 minutes left. And what I was going to do was going to ask just for in terms of moving on, what would be one recommendation? Not to government, not to that, but one recommendation, because the people sitting in this room are the people who are interested in the issue. Right? What would be our panellists, one recommendation to people sitting in this room who wanted to do more about it? Where should they start? Or what should be the take-home message as individuals? Because it's individuals that change the world, we know that. And I'm going to start off with Peter, because he's smiling at me.
Yeah, I think it was a great proposal to use the World Cup in Qatar, and I myself delivered 2 abstracts for this conference that were turned down exactly around the same issue, because if we look what gay men achieved with the Olympics in Russia, and if we look on how fiercely the rights of migrant workers are violated in Qatar to build up these sports events. I just wonder why don't we come up with the idea to address the situation of HIV-positive migrant workers and come up with a strong strategy. The World Cup is still some years ahead, but we should build up a strategy, and we should bring the key players together, and maybe some of these corrupt sport managers, and just make them accountable. It should be possible.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, that's an activist speaking. I love it. Manuel, Or Owe, this is not mandatory, but if you want to, go for it.
Speak.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just looking forward. For me, as a PLHIV, of people living with HIV as a migrant workers, in the Philippines, a lot of Filipino, if the Filipino coming from other countries, been back to the Philippines, after 2 to 3 days, we died, or we found out that the loss, or we found out lying in the bed because some of the migrant workers didn't, like example in Saudi Arabia, if found out it's positive, then come back to the Philippines. There's no coordinating from the country or through the Philippines, so we do not find out. They cannot find out where's the migrant workers coming, or where's the migrant workers happen, because there's no coordinating from the government of the Philippines to the Saudi Arabia.
So amelioration. Even if you're going to kick somebody out of the country, at least tell them where they can get support in your own country. You know, which might be a small step. Manuel.
Thank you. We in Bangkok, together with ILO and UNDP, we have a strategy to address travel restrictions here in the region, and I am the focal point at UNAIDS, and we are working closely to address. At the moment, we are going to commission a study for Singapore and try to understand the circle in Singapore, and we're trying just to try to identify the consultant at the moment, because we are going to send an high-level mission to Singapore government to start a dialogue with Singapore officials on travel restrictions, because the problem in Singapore is even worse for people living with HIV. Access to treatment, access to medicines is a catastrophe that's going on. So we are taking opportunity to go to Singapore, and we know that more or less when something happens in Singapore, there's a reflection also in Brunei. And for the Pacific Islands, we have about 5 countries with travel restrictions, and we are trying to, as an opportunity of the SIDS, Small Island Development States Conference, that is going to happen in Samoa, and this is where we are working with governments for them to try to announce some good news before September, when the SIDS conference is going to take place in Samoa. And also for PNG, we had a high-level mission as well with our Deputy Executive Director, where we had a good dialogue with the government, but we don't know what are the results. We did a fantastic study in PNG with very good recommendations. They have all the information they need to know. We had meetings here with Michelle and the Minister of Health present at the conference here from PNG. This is our strategy. Malaysia is a country that's still not opened the door for discussions with UNAIDS. So far, we have written to them, we have contacted them, and there's no way of starting dialogue.
So small incremental steps.
Yeah.
Persistent drip, drip, drip.
Yeah, trying
That's
to
where
find
this stone down.
opportunities.
Okay, thank you.
Entry points.
Asif?
I think focused intervention. I think, like, again, what we are talking about, Qatar Airways and World Cup, I think that type of like targeted focal intervention can bring global attention, and that can really make some changes. So from trade union side, I think global attention on particular companies targeting particular countries can be very useful. And World Cup is big thing. And we just have the World Cup last month, and we can feel how big it is. You know, it can make a huge difference.
So I just think I've seen a contract signed between yourself and Peter to spearhead a campaign. So that's really great. Joanne.
So from the private sector side, I certainly think this is an issue that is something that's so huge we can't go it alone. And an example of a campaign that we started in 2012 in partnership with UNAIDS and GBC Health, that is still ongoing, was a CEO pledge campaign where we ask CEOs of leading companies to sign a pledge calling on governments to end travel-related restrictions for HIV positive people. And that campaign is still ongoing. We've gotten 49 signatories to date, which includes companies like Coca-Cola, Heineken, Merck, a lot of the companies that are here today. So I think we certainly have a voice, and as we heard, money talks. So businesses do have a part to play. So if anybody's interested, or you are from an organization that would like to participate, certainly reach out to any one of us from UNAIDS, myself, or GBC Health.
Thank you. Matt?
Again, I think just tagging onto this, the solution's going to come from business, and it's going to be business leading on these issues because they have the most to gain by this workforce, and they're going to be looked to for leadership on this issue, and they've always led at least in the U.S. They've always led when politicians were afraid to lead.
Can I just give you, somebody from the States, a challenge? Of course, 2012 was really nice for being in Washington. There were also people who were not there from our most marginalised communities. So, you know, moral turpitude is all I say to you. That sex workers did not feel that was a wide enough aim. Neither did drug users, which is why there were two hub mechanisms, you know, going on, because they didn't feel that it had gone far enough, your country's restrictions upon people. So just a challenge for you.
Point well taken, and that's certainly an area where we have great work to do.
Arthur.
As a positive voice here, I would like to just call upon governments and employers to treat us as equal and to give us an opportunity to prove that we can work as model workers and we are model citizens wherever we live.
Thank you.
I suppose I'd just say Australia needs to clean its own backyard up first before we start making grandiose statements about what should happen internationally. But I think the focus on the World Cup is, I think it's an excellent entry point because the issue of migrant workers is something that's largely hidden. But for the first time, we're going to see this enormous investment in infrastructure around an issue that people can identify with, and it's going to be fuelled and built on the back of that population, that group, and what better opportunity is there to focus the eyes of the world on some of the issues that those people are facing.
Great. So now we have a tripartite partnership with government, trade union and community putting together a campaign. I look forward to it and hearing from it. In closing, we have run slightly over, but we had the room a little bit longer, so we're not excluding anybody from outside. Suzette, Alice, would you like to close at all? It's up to you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I wanted to thank all the panelists. I think the presentations give us a lot of insight, and I think at the end of this session, we will all agree that they have enhanced our knowledge, and that we are leaving this room with some specific ideas on how we can make things move ahead. One thing I've noticed is that there aren't many sessions during this conference discussing this very important issue. And yet it is a very important issue. I think we should try to be a little bit more aggressive in the subsequent meetings so that we have more and more such sessions that discuss this issue, because there are a growing number of migrant workers and necessarily a growing number of migrant workers living with HIV who are facing the kind of difficulties and hurdles that we heard so eloquently from Owi. But I have a few questions. I didn't hear the word gender once in the presentations, and yet we know that there is a feminization of migrant workers. Who are they? Certainly they do have different experiences, and we need also to unpack and to have a kind of gender balanced view of the way these issues should be taken up. Another question is, we know very often that in the countries, the sending countries and the receiving countries, you do have individuals or organizations or bodies that actually give the priority to the economic aspect of the migration to the detriment of the rights of the migrant workers. We do have a lot of indelicate recruitment agencies in sending countries, and I think these are issues also that we should be looking at. Another issue which I think is important, because we focus a lot on international migration, fine, but we know that there are 5 times more internal migrants. Of course, restriction to entry is not really the issue, but restriction on stay and residence is an issue. you do have a lot of rural migrant workers living with HIV because they move to the city, their treatment is interrupted. So what do we do about these issues? So I think we should be dealing with all these issues. Yes, there is a lot of progress. Yes, we all agree on the rules, on the principles that should guide migration. No mandatory testing. It should be voluntary. It should be confidential. Migrant workers living with HIV should be able to access HIV services throughout every step of the migration process. But this is not happening, and this is where we should put our efforts. Lastly, I think it's very important that we continue building evidence, coming up with ideas in order to be able to provide very concrete proposals to policymakers, to program implementers, to recruitment agencies, and so on and so forth. But I think, and this is my last word, we need to really initiate a dialogue between an inter-regional dialogue between sending and receiving countries. There's a lot that has been done in this region. A few attempts that are made, for example, in the MENA region, this is the Middle East and North Africa. But we know that when talking about international migration, most of the traffic is between these two regions, and this dialogue is not actually taking place. With UNAIDS and other partners, we've been working separately with the two regions, hoping that at one point we'll bring them together. Because I think it's only through dialogue that we can make progress. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Can I just say that for me this has been a fabulous session. Thank you all for coming. In 1.5 hours, we've had 18 speakers. I think that's a record for this conference. And I would just say to you that the wonderful man there has pointed out that if you want to follow up on this, if you haven't already, there is a session on Thursday, THWS07, HIV Prevention and Care for Migrants and Mobile Populations, in room 101 and 102 between 14:30 and 17:30. Can I just say thank you to the audience and thank you to our panel for stepping up.